Hello, I'm Abigail Pogrebin, and I'm usually on In the Spotlight on JBS, but this is a special conversation we're having because I don't have to tell anyone watching this that Israel has been in turmoil and also, I think, in very many uplifting ways, showing its mettle and its power and its strength in terms of the hundreds of thousands that have been in the streets over what was about to happen and has now been halted by the Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, in terms of judicial reforms and everything that was going to accompany those reforms. I am with Amanda Berman, who is the creator of Zionists, a very important organization that stands for both progressive values and causes, as well as being unflinchingly and unapologetically Zionist. So welcome, Amanda.
Thank you.
So just right now, every day, every hour, there's been kind of a new moment. And I know Zionist does not take political positions, but just from your stand, from where you stand, where are we? How would you kind of encapsulate it?
We're in a really troubling moment. And, you know, I think that, well, I'll say that Zionist doesn't take positions on Israeli politics and policy, but we do take positions on Zionism, and democracy is at the foundation of Zionism. The Zionist dream, the modern political Zionist dream, Herzl's dream, was creating a Jewish democracy in the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, the land of Israel. And when democracy is at stake, Zionism is at stake. So certainly, you know, I have feelings about that, and I know the whole Zionist community does. I think where we are in this moment is, it's a very perilous moment. I know people want to take a breath and want to, you know, have a good night's sleep and think about what happens next. I think right now there's a negotiation that is potentially going to start happening with President Herzog, with Bibi, with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition, yeah, and with the opposition, with Lapid, with Bennett, and with Gantz. And I don't necessarily feel all that hopeful that there is going to be common ground, because, you know, you have people that were willing to completely overhaul the entire judiciary, the only check or balance that there is on executive power in Israel, and to do it immediately with no conversation, totally unwilling to even consider how, you know, the other side, which is more than half of Israeli society, are feeling. So it's sort of hard to imagine that we could get to a place where everybody feels good. I don't know how we would get there.
I remember at the very beginning when these judicial reforms were kind of proposed or percolating, that there were many people here who said to me, Abby, you know, just kind of chill out. Everyone's overreacting. It's not so bad. Let's see how it plays out. And that turned so quickly, and it turned in sort of a bipartisan way. I know there's not typical parties in Israel, but whether you were here in America or in the larger Jewish community in Israel, you just saw there was a kind of consensus of alarm.
Yes.
And that is something I haven't seen in my lifetime, and, you know, where it really crossed religious kind of lines and political lines, philosophical lines. Everyone had a reason to be worried.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't seen something like this in a democracy, certainly in my lifetime. As Jews, I mean, seeing this in Israel is extraordinarily painful. And also Israel can't afford it. You know, Israel cannot afford this kind of societal division. As we know, so many people are refusing to go to the reserves. You know, the military is suffering, which of course is why the defense minister made a statement and said that.
And there were Israelis who were thinking of leaving.
There are many Israelis who I think have left. There are Israeli businesses who have left. The economy is tanking. The shekel is collapsing. I mean, the society is on hold. And so I do remember at the beginning when this conversation started and people saying they'll figure it out. And I think there was good reason to think they would figure it out. I don't think anyone, Bibi most of all, was anticipating the way that Israeli society was going to respond to this.
So is there hope in the way that it did? Is there some
Absolutely.
sense, I used the word uplifting and maybe that was too strong, but is this a snapshot of democracy at its best?
Absolutely, without question. And, you know, you and I have talked about this before. I think that this is one of the most inspiring shows of democratic force that I've ever seen anywhere, you know, let alone in Israel. And this happened in America, you know, something very similar happened in America. Americans didn't rally like this.
No, you didn't see people turning out this way.
Absolutely not. I mean, 20% of Israeli, there were a lot of people at the Women's March, but 20% of Israeli society have participated in these protests at some point. 20% of American society is what, like 75 million people? Yeah. I mean, 75 million people?
Unimaginable.
It's unimaginable.
Yeah.
So, I think there's so much that we're not even hearing about here, and I'm following so obsessively, just reloading Twitter, especially this past weekend. And I think what a lot of people aren't realizing is there's these three big pieces of legislation that we're all aware of, that we all know to be problematic. Apparently, there's something like 140 other smaller pieces of legislation that this government is trying to pass. And they include things like being able to give gifts of any size to any elected leader without consequence. And of course, we know that Bibi is facing trial for accepting bribes and for corruption. So, stuff like that, I mean, that is totally undermining any potential to have a sane government that is representing its people. So, there's so much here. And of course, Israeli society is not going to tolerate it.
I was fortunate to be able to interview 3 IDF reservists, high-ranking officers here at this table very recently, and it really struck me, I think maybe more than I expected. They kept coming back to the ethical compass and orientation of their training and their actions and the restraints on the battlefield. Yes. Or in in combat, and that has been a guiding principle and guardrail that is at the heart of IDF training and orientation. And, let's put aside, I'm sure there are many listening who say, really, the IDF is completely guided by an ethical compass? But it was profound to me that what they were particularly feeling was in the balance, was the idea that they might actually have to carry out illegal, unethical orders. And that's part of why they were opting out. I think when you think about what Zionist does and progressive values and the idea of what is guiding you and your compass, that very much dovetails for me, this sense of like, what is a Jew? And even one of the officers said is, what is Jewish?
Yes. I love
so can you address that a bit?
Yes, and I watched that, and anyone who hasn't seen it absolutely has to. It was really beautiful and powerful and courageous of them to come here and have that conversation, I think. And actually, just as a side note, I feel that the protests that are happening in the U.S., it should be Israelis. Not that Americans can't go and support, but I do feel that this is an Israeli fight that we as Americans can support, but shouldn't be, the primary voice. And so them coming here and leading the conversation, I think, is critical. I think, I've had a lot of conversations with people who don't realize that there is a connection between the security issues and the judicial issues. And the reservists who came here spoke to this beautifully. But when you have a minister in the defense ministry saying that he wants the state to wipe out a Palestinian town, essentially to commit genocide, and you have people who volunteer for the army, who have to, if the army is going to function properly, have to take the orders that they receive and act on them in real time, and can't double, triple check to make sure that the orders are coming from a good place and authority that can be trusted. They have to just do it. And also understanding that the reason, the world comes after Israel and Israelis at every given opportunity at any moment. And certainly we know that the United Nations and our international institutions do hold Israel and Israelis to a double standard. The fact that there is a robust judiciary, including military tribunals in Israel, in the IDF, are what allow Israelis to travel abroad without fear of prosecution and arrest at the International Criminal Court. So the idea that soldiers could, be following orders that are coming from a Ben Gvir or a Smotrich type, let alone one of them, Smotrich is making comments like this, they could literally be they could be absolutely violating human rights law, international human rights law. They could be committing, crimes of atrocity, and they could be prosecuted for it. It's not possible.
I want to tell viewers that you're also trained as a lawyer, so this isn't just your knowledge of how Israel works. Yeah,
and these are things that absolutely happen and should happen if the international criminal system is to work. Many will say that international criminal law isn't real anyway, but that's a whole other conversation. Certainly there will be people who try to apply it to Israelis at any opportunity. So,
and how do you respond? Maybe it's unfair, but I'm going to put you on the spot, to those who are saying, suddenly all these people are in the streets, suddenly Israelis are saying we're trying to protect democracy. This hasn't been a democracy for 50 years ever since occupation. So how do you respond to that criticism?
I'm frustrated by it, as you can imagine. Israel is absolutely a democracy, a robust, extraordinary democracy, maybe, as we're watching, one of the most resilient democracies in the world, and has a very complicated situation with its neighbors. Palestinians have two governments. So the idea that, everything the Israeli government does, or that everything Palestinians are subjected to is because of the Israeli government, is just wrong.
Explaining that's Hamas and PA.
Yeah, the Palestinian Authority. So, it's absurd, frankly, to say that Israel is not a democracy because it's not allowing the vote, for example, to people who have voted in their own governments, very corrupt governments, very problematic governments, but democratically elected governments. So, that doesn't mean, and I think part of the problem is when you have these conversations, like I say something like that and people think I don't care about Palestinians or that I don't care about the occupation. And of course I do. I care very, very deeply about it. And I think two things are often true at the same time, and in this case are definitely true. Israelis are protesting for the dream of Zionism, which is a Jewish democratic state in their ancestral homeland. And I believe that part of what they are witnessing and experiencing is, an understanding of the way that Palestinians see the Israeli government. I think that there is a wake-up call that's happening, and I think there is amazing potential for the future that if we get through this moment in one piece, really can kind of remake the way that we view the conflict and view the Israeli government and think about democracy there and think about, how everyone can live, liberated lives, self-determined lives. But we're not there yet. And I'm frustrated for a lot of reasons, one of which is I think this is a moment to really celebrate the protesters who have taken on something unimaginable, and the scale and scope of what they've done. I mean, they've shut down the entire economy. The labor unions are on strike. The universities are not in session. The airport is shut down. I mean, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange was closed.
And in fairness, I've also seen, because I've been on Twitter as well, that there are Arab voices that
absolutely
are supportive of it and
yes.
see this as actually, these were going to be reforms that were very perilous for them as well. Absolutely.
So
let's just finish with the American Jewish community and how engaged do you think we are? How much are we understanding what's at stake here? In the crowds that you run in, are people taking the time to kind of read what you're reading? And because a lot of it is, it can get very complicated. There's a lot to follow. And I'm not saying that in any kind of patronizing way. It's hard to follow.
Yeah.
But also just a sense of engagement and caring. Like, are American Jews caring the way you wish they were? And also, are they disengaging because they feel disgusted with kind of the turn that Israel may be taking? This is not the Zionism I signed on for.
Yeah. Again, I think that anyone who's actually watching what's going on has to be inspired. It's very hard for me to imagine watching this. I mean, I'm seeing anti-Zionists posting along the lines of the question that you just asked. People are like, well, I'm pretty happy to see Israelis protesting their government. I wish that they had been protesting for the last 50 years. But I mean, they are absolutely astonished by the force of what's happening here. So, I don't think anyone who's actually watching what's going on could just turn away and say, well, not a big deal, not inspired by it. It's not what I signed up for. I think people are following it to whatever extent they can without being kind of bombarded, and I've signed up to be bombarded, as have you. I'm like obsessed with, every detail, and I have friends, in Israel texting me constantly at whatever protest they're at, telling me who's speaking and what's going on. I would like to see more engagement, and I would like to see it coming from a place of love. And it's not to say that there's engagement coming from a place of negativity. It's that I feel like people are kind of confused about where. I don't even think it's apathy. I think people care and don't know where to plug in because it is so complicated. And as I said before, I think, there have been some protests happening. My mom went to a protest when I was protesting in Israel. She went to a protest in Philadelphia. And I spoke to her about it afterward, and I said, what happened at the protest? And she said, we didn't really know. We were kind of standing there with Israeli flags. You know, it wasn't really clear what we were doing there.
What to chant.
Yeah, and then she was kind of asking me questions about what was actually going on the ground in Israel, and I was explaining. And, you know, one thing I think is worth saying is that I think a huge percentage of the Israeli population agrees that there does need to be judicial reform, that the Israeli Supreme Court has, you know, arguably more power than any judicial system in the world, and that there does need to be, I mean, as you know, Israel doesn't have a constitution. Right. So it doesn't have any kind of outline as to how the different systems are supposed to interact with each other, who's supposed to have power, under what circumstances, and to what limit. That's an important thing to get figured out, you know? Whether it's through a constitution or something else. And so I think there is a real conversation to have about judicial reform in Israel. It's just what the conversation has been is not about reform, it's about destruction and overhaul. And so that's hard for people to even understand. And the reason I thought of it is because when I was talking about this with my mom, and I said, you know, it's not just, like, there is a reasonable conversation to be had on judicial reform, you know, and she was like, well, I didn't realize that, you know? And so I think there's, which of course, I'm not surprised that, you know, she didn't realize that. And so there's so many people who are like, I'm in solidarity with the Israelis protesting. I don't really understand what's going on. I don't know how to express my solidarity because I know, like, Bibi bad, you know, protesters good. But I do think we need to get a little bit deeper in and be able to say, here's why we think it's anti-democratic. Here's why it's not consistent with our Jewish democratic values and our Zionism. And, you know, here's what we would like to see.
And here's what the stakes might be.
Here's what the stakes might be.
If in a sense the protesters lose.
Yeah.
Amanda Berman from Zionist, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
And I'm Abigail Pogrebin on JBS. Good to see you and hope to see you next time.